Chapter 8, Student-Centered or Constructivist Approaches to Instruction. So what is the constructivist view of learning? I already told you back in Chapter 2 that Vygotsky and Piaget both were constructivists. They believe that children actually contributed to the construction of knowledge, so that without interacting with your environment, then knowledge would not occur. So constructivists believe that knowing is a process that learners must individually and actively discover and transform in order to make it their own. It's that idea of assimilation and accommodation. They keep playing with the information. If it's new and different, then they have to make a new category and new synapses appear. Constructivist approaches emphasize the top-down processing, in which students begin with a complex problem or task and discover the basic knowledge and skills needed to solve the problem or perform the task. A lot of times people like to break things apart or do a task analysis, and they break it into the little individual parts, and then they teach the kids each individual part and assume that they'll be able to put the whole piece together. What they've really found is that's not really how children naturally learn. They naturally take the big picture and then break it down themselves. So constructivist approaches also emphasize cooperative learning, like Vygotsky talked about. You have to have that mediated instructor. Questioning and inquiry strategies. You got to question and inquire about it, and other metacognitive skills. The historical root of constructivism goes back all the way back in the history. A long time ago, before we had formal secondary education, we had apprenticeship programs. So you went in and you worked under a master and you learned your trade through watching and observing and getting the big picture. So it draws heavily on the work of Piaget and Vygotsky, both who emphasize the cognitive changes that take place when previous conceptions or misconceptions go through that process of disequilibrium. So if you're in disequilibrium, then you have to assimilate new information. So constructivism theories have been used to support classroom instruction that emphasizes cooperative learning, project-based learning, and discovery learning. Top-down processing. Probably the best way to explain this is that you emphasize the big picture. The term top-down means students begin with complex problem to solve, and then they work out or discover, with guidance of the teacher or some other person that's knowledgeable, the basic skills required. For example, a student might be asked to write a composition and only later learn about spelling and grammar. Let me show you kind of an example too. Your book gives a couple examples. Can anyone give me a story that would go with a multiplication of 12 times 4? There were 12 cups of hot chocolate and each had 4 marshmallows in it. So if I did a multiplication about the story, what would I find out about the marshmallows? You'd know how many marshmallows you used in all. Wonderful. Let's draw a picture to help us understand the multiplication problem. Here's the 12 cups, and there are 4 marshmallows in each cup, and then shows pictures on the whiteboard. As always, it's easier for us to count how many marshmallows there are altogether if we think of the cups in groups. Can anyone tell us what our favorite number for thinking in groups is? 10 is usually it. Right. So each of these 10 cups have 4 marshmallows, and then they draw a circle around the 10 cups. Can you tell how many marshmallows you have in the circle? We have 40 marshmallows. How did you get that? Well, 10 times 4 is 40. And so then you would do the 2 separately as well. 2 times 4 is 8. So 40 plus 8 is 48. So that would be a different way of being able to construct that knowledge when you start to look at kids and then teach them the strategies that go along with it. That's where that idea of metacognition comes in. I'm also going to take you to a different idea. Here's one that's a jigsaw puzzle. I don't know if you can see the entire jigsaw puzzle. I'll move it over a little bit. If I were just to give you these pieces of puzzle, do you think that you would be able to do this? Typically, no. When you're doing a puzzle, the first thing that you want to do is get the big picture. If I were just to give you all these little pieces, you would have no idea what this puzzle was about. However, if I were to show you the picture, you might go, oh, okay. But typically, the first thing that we do in a puzzle is, if I can do it, if it's letting me. No, it doesn't want to do it. It will actually get rid of all the other pieces outside of the outside pieces. And so then I can kind of move them around. I'm not going to do the puzzle, but I can move them around. And I can find the puzzle pieces that go together. I'd actually like to solve one of these, but let me look for a dark piece of puzzle. So if I move them around, I know that this is a corner piece. So I can put the corner piece over here. And then this one, I don't know where they're going to. I can put right here, but I don't know how to turn it around. Not very good at the online puzzles. Aha, I got a piece. Maybe I shouldn't do this right now. So you get the idea. So when I'm doing a puzzle and I'm trying to create a puzzle, looks like they go together, but I guess they don't. Yeah, they do. There you go. Trying to create a puzzle. I'm going to do the outside square first, or rectangle first, before I do the puzzle. So I get the big idea by looking at the picture, and then I'm able to create the puzzle based on looking at the big idea first. So that's probably the best example of what I can give of what top-down processing is. You would never, unless you really had or a glutton for punishment, you wouldn't start with this entire puzzle pieces without looking at a picture, because you would have absolutely no idea what went where. So when we do top-down processing, one of the first things that we want to think about when we're doing that is the idea of what's the big picture. So you want to present a problem first and then move from that problem on. Another big aspect of constructivist approach is this idea that there's interaction among students the same age, or among teachers as well. The constructivist approach relies on the theory that students will more easily discover and comprehend difficult concepts if they talk to one another about the problems. So you have to have this incubation period where kids are able to discuss and think. Peer interaction involves groups of peers modeling appropriate ways of thinking and exposing, challenging, and exposing and challenging each other's misconceptions. So it's creating that classroom where you know that you're unafraid to give your opinion, and that you can be wrong, and it's not a bad thing to be wrong. Which brings us to the idea there's a lot of different ways that we can do this. We can do this first with discovery learning. Discovery learning is an important component of modern constructivist approaches with a long history of education innovation. In discovery learning, students are encouraged to learn largely on their own through active involvement with concepts and principles. Another example that I have, and let me see if I can find that one. Oh, wrong one. Hold on. I can't find it now. Pause this. So a discovery type learning, there's lots of different ones that you can do, but a lot of them do things like games or experiments and stuff like that. And this is one I just found that it's on bridge building. So we're talking about like an engineering kind of physics game, and this is an easier one. And if I do play the game, I've already played it a little bit. I'm going to take you to level 3. I haven't passed level 5 yet, but number 3. So the kids get this idea. They've got this train that are going along, and I'm going to want to put this truss in here. It's kind of hard. And then it's not the easiest thing to do. I just thought I'd tell you. And then I got my truss. There's another one over here. And I can build that. That's a little easier to get in there. I can build that truss, and I've got them set there. And then I tell it to go ahead and hit play. Will my train make it across? It was a little rough, but it made it. Oh, I got some bonus points there too. So as I went through, when I click to continue, it keeps going up level by level. This next one is a little bit different in that what ends up happening is it's like there's holes in my area, so I have to be able to fill my holes, which was, by the way, was kind of difficult. I'm getting better at it. Yeah, see how that sounds kind of hard to get in there. There we go. And I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put that one in there. I'm going to take these ones, I'm going to put them over here. But see how kids, through discovery, they're learning their own mistakes. I should screw up, and I can show you what happens when you screw up. Well, the next one's kind of interesting because it has bombs on it, and you have to actually like build trusses over the bombs in order to make sure that they don't, your train doesn't blow up. I've blown up my train twice. But as I've done this, and as you can see if I click to continue, there's all these different levels, and each one requires the child to start thinking about ways to solve the problem and be able to fill the hole or fill the gap. And it has like basic construction ideas of load and what kind of load you have to use. And this would be for a little bit earlier kid because the trusses are already built. But there's other ones that are on bridge building and such like that get that do the same type of thing where they test the bridge that they built. And when you do that, it actually, the children discover what's important about what you have to do. Like, how do you actually get over a hurdle? Like, how do you plug up a fault in the ground? And so you're dealing with concepts and principles that have to do with architecture and engineering, but you're doing it in a way where kids are discovering this themselves, so that later on when you go to this idea of building and creating this truss that you would do, and how much weight bearing and what is the best weight bearers, and the kids already have kind of a basic concept of what they are, and they've already discovered which principles work and which ones don't. So teachers encourage students to have experiences and conduct experiments that permit them to discover the principles for themselves, so that later on when they're trying to figure out which type of truss to use, they can understand why this one would work and how much weight it would need. Another aspect that they talk about in constructivist learning is this idea of self-regulated learning. And what you want, this is what we want kids to be. We want them to be self-regulated learners. And what we want them to do is break down complex problems into some kind of simpler steps. And then we want them to test out those alternative and solutions. And then we want them to do some own research and read for deeper understanding, so that they have to figure out what they're doing and why they're doing it. And then write to persuade or write to inform. I think about my son's third grade teacher. When he was in third grade, she posed the problem of there was a grant competition that was going on, and it was like for it was YAR, Youth as Resources, and the YAR program wanted the youth in the area to become involved in your community and what kind of problems that you had in your community. There's a lot of different types of ones that kids were proposing to do, but these third grade class, she proposed it to the third grade class, and she said, what do you think that we should do that would make our community better? Well, the school that they were at was a rather old school, and they had a bunch of portables in the back, and the kids were talking about school pride and how the portables just kind of looked stuck out there, and that it didn't make the school look good, and that if you had school pride, that kids tended to do better in school, and they felt excited about coming to school. So the kids decided they were going to beautify around the portables, and they were going to make them seem not so temporary, but make them seem as though they were part of the landscape. So the teacher didn't tell them what to do. She let them brainstorm, and they actually came up with all these different proposals about what they would do. And so she just gave them materials and information that would help them. So when they were talking about landscaping, she brought in somebody over from the Ag Center over off of 44 in DeLand, and they talked about zero landscaping because there were no they solved some other problems, because they said, well, how are we going to water these plants? If we put grass out here, it's just going to die because there's no sprinkler system. So they started talking about the idea of zero landscape. So when they did their research, these are third graders, they researched like what zero landscaping meant and what plants were native to Florida so that they would be more heat resistant. And so she brought in a horticulturalist that talked about native Florida plants. They talked about zero landscaping and how the plants that need more water need to be built up a little bit. Less water need to be built up a little bit, and they can be a little higher off the ground. And then the ones that need more water, when the water drains, will puddle in an area, and then they'll get more water. So they actually had the kids with this little computer program design what kind of plants they were going to get and where they were going to put their plants. So they had all these different alternative solutions, and then the kids had each landscaping design that they presented to the group, and then the group decided on which one they thought was best and which plants they thought were best. It was so interesting to watch them, because even at night, like after school, there would be kids here that would be over here talking to each other, and they were researching different types of plants and talking about whether or not they should bring in some dirt, different kind of dirt. And then actually after they did that, they presented the grant to the YAR group, which is a community group. They were up against 12th graders and 11th graders and all these different other types of groups. And this little third grade class, a group of about 8 kids in the third grade who were, that was their final project that went forward, they ended up getting a $5,000 grant. And then because they won the whole thing, they also got a trip to Universal for their class. So they really had to do a presentation where they had to do a PowerPoint, and they had to present their findings and everything. And it was so interesting to watch these little 8th graders compete against 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds for this. And they won. And the coolest part, when you talk about reading for deeper understanding and knowing, towards the end of the project, they realized that they probably would need more enriched soil. So for the next year, they talked their teacher into writing a new grant to do compost, to create a compost in the back, so they could recycle the waste from the cafeteria. And that helped create this nutrient-rich soil that they used to fertilize and to supplement the gardens that they created. And to this day, there's plants and plant life all along the outsides of the portables. This is also that idea of scaffolding. So those people that the teacher brought in my son's class, they were people that were scaffolding. They did mediated learning. So Vygotsky talked about this. Remember he talked about riding the bike, that you run around and ride a bike with it? So Vygotsky said higher mental functions, including the ability to direct memory and attention, has to do with symbols and mediated behavior. And when we assist in learning, or we mediate learning, teachers, who are that cultural agent, act as guides so that students can start to master and internalize these skills. Those kids didn't know how to use a landscaping tool. They didn't know anything about native Florida plants, but there was somebody that came in that was the expert and taught them how to do that. And then they slowly released it. And the kids had a purpose for this. It wasn't just like we're learning how to landscape or we're learning about compost or whatever. There was a purpose for their learning, so then they were eager to learn it. So when we look at constructivist models in specific content areas, there was a lot of them that your book talks about. When they talk about areas in reading, that's a reciprocal teaching, and that's primarily used with low achievers in elementary and middle school. When reading comprehension involves a teacher working with small groups of students, and initially you model questions students might ask as they read, and then as soon as they are appointed, they get to act as the teacher, and they get to generate questions. So one person's a teacher and one person's a student, and then they switch roles and they go back and forth. The other one is questioning the author. This can be used with anyone, and in this method, children grade 3 to 9 are taught to use the author as a factual material, as real, valuable people, and to engage in simulated dialogues with the author. So it would be like you were asking, well, why would you create a character like that? Or what do you think Marcus might be thinking? And how does that fit in with what she said before? And what are you trying to tell me right here? What do you think the author is trying to tell me? And so they're real, valuable people, and you engage in simulated dialogues with the authors, and then you can use that approach for trying to get at what you think the story is all about. It really helps with main idea. An author's intent, which is a big one that kids have to be tested on. There's also the concept-oriented reading instruction, or the CORI, and it's a constructive approach of teaching reading in the upper elementary grades. And the 5 key elements of that one are content goals, where students read material focused primarily on science goals. Given students choices, students are able to choose books and read topics in depth about whatever they want to learn. Hands-on activities related to the text, so students explore maybe science concepts in a hands-on activity. And then it's intended to benefit science learning and reading learning. So you're learning about science through reading, and then they're kind of complementing each other. There's also a variety of expository informational texts that go along with it. So you're getting this informational text that go along with it. And then you get to collaborate among students and work together among students. Numerous studies of CORE have found positive effects on children's reading comprehension and on their motivation. Also in writing, we have a constructive approach to writing. And most writing models have to do with this, where students have peer response teams in which they work together to plan, draft, revise, edit, and publish compositions. If you watch any of the videos, I have some videos that I'm going to put up as well that are teacher-directed videos that are in our Torch program, but Mrs. Diedrich is really good about this. She does little small group instruction where she talks about that, and she has the kids revise and write together. There's also in mathematics, there's the STST, or the supporting 10 structured thinking. And children use base 10 blocks to invent procedures for adding and subtracting large numbers. They also use the conceptually based instruction, or CBI instruction, and that's extensive use of physical, pictorial, verbal, and symbolic representation of math ideas. That example that I used before when we did the cups would be an example of a CBI method. We also have the problem-centered mathematics approach, which leads children through stages from modeling with counters to solving more abstract problems without counters. And then the cognitive guided instruction, or the CGI instruction, which is a specific curriculum and it's recommended activities that provide extensive professional development for teachers in primary mathematics. Unlike that, no, it's not actually. The STST is, and the CBI does not have a specific curriculum or recommended. It's really just getting kids related to higher level thinking of mathematics. So you move from the focus of computational skills to that high level thinking skills. We all want children to do mental mathematics or mental math. So you have to move them away from that concrete where they're using counters or visual representation, and you want to get them to be able to look at it in your head. That goes along with it. Another constructive approach when we look at in science is that discovery learning, like I was just showing you with the engineering and science idea. When you use group work and conceptual change, scientific experiments is pretty much discovery learning. Unfortunately, a lot of times teachers think that kids have to do the experiment and get the right answer, but sometimes not getting the right answer or doing the experiment wrong, you learn just as much as you do if you get it right, as long as you have a model of what it should have come out to be, and then you have to have them figure out what they did wrong and why they didn't get that same answer. The research, though, on constructivist models and comparing constructivist to like a direct instruction approach or traditional approach to instruction is difficult to interpret, because when you're doing a constructivist model, you're not necessarily coming up with the right answer, which is what happens in direct instruction. And constructivist methods are very diverse in that we could be doing a science experiment, we could be doing reciprocal teaching. They're very, very different. But the outcomes are more qualitative than they are quantitative, meaning that you may not necessarily always get the higher reading scores, but yet when you talk to the children, they have a deeper understanding of what it is. So more research needs to be done on this constructive approach to determining what is the most effective way that we can enhance achievement. Another one that comes along when we're talking about the constructive approach is cooperative learning instruction. And small groups of children work together to help one another. And they're used in discovery learning, they're used in discussion techniques, they're used for study for assessment, like in your STAD groups. And STAD is one of the ones, typically in my regular EdSci classes, I do a STAD where I take your first 2 tests and I average them, and then I put you in groups. And whoever's group raises their test score the most gets bonus points. So when you do STAD, they're successful because they reward both group. So you get bonus points if your group does better, but you also reward individual effort. So you could never get hurt by a STAD group. Most people don't like to do cooperative learning groups because somebody always gets stuck doing most of the work. And they feel other people skate and get the same grade, even though that one person did more work. But because the groups are responsible for their individual learning, so each person is responsible for an individual piece of it, then everybody is actually contributing the same. So STAD groups are mixed in performance level, gender, and ethnicity. So when we're doing a STAD group, it's kind of like the Kagan groups. Kagan and Slavin both talk about this the same. That you're going to have, this is a horrible drawing of a high. I'm going to have my high here. And I'm have my medium to my medium low over here. And then I'm going to have my medium or medium high over here and my low or my low over here. So if I have a high, two mediums, and two lows, or a high and a low and two mediums, or a medium low and a medium high, a medium high and a medium low. These two right here are going to be shoulder partners, and these two are going to be shoulder partners. And what this is that the high, if you put a high and a low together, usually the high will end up doing all the work and the low just sits there and feels stupid. But if you have a medium or a medium high or a medium low or just a medium, not real low, but just a medium kid with the high, they can pretty much hold their own with the high kid. And the high kid is going to pull them up a little bit, but they're not going to feel dragged down by it. The medium high or the medium kid and the low kid or the low kid, that medium kid is not too far above it so that they can actually contribute to it. So you never pair a high with a low because that's just too far apart. You also want to make sure that you mix up by gender and then ethnicity as well. So in cooperative learning instructional methods or peer-assisted learning, students work together in small groups to help learn from each other. Most involve students in 4-member groups, and they're usually mixed ability groups. Some methods use dyads, and then some vary group sizes as well. Typically, students are assigned to cooperative learning groups and stay together for many weeks or many months. So some teachers I know do it by every month. By the way, there's Kagan has a really good, I don't think I have it on this computer, but he has a really good program that's called Team Maker. And you actually put in the kids' like reading scores or the test scores and stuff, and it will actually generate teams so that you don't have to worry about who's high, who's low, and all that kind of stuff. And it will generate them to make sure that your groups are equal. And if you put in their gender and stuff like that too, it'll make sure that it does it by gender as well, because that takes a long time. And when you look at cooperative learning, there's not just working on the academic piece, and we're going to talk about the different types of cooperative learning that you can have. But we had STAD already that they talked about. Then you have team games tournament, which students play games with members of other teams, and then they add points. A lot of times it's like Jeopardy or something like that that goes along with that. Sometimes with reading integration, you have the CIRC, C-I-R-C, which is Cooperative Integrated Reading and Composition, and that involves students working in 4-member cooperative teams. They engage in a series of activities with one another, including reading to one another, and making predictions about the story, how it's going to come out, summarizing what the author is going to say, and then writing drafts, and then revising and editing. One of the things that comes out of cooperative learning, though, is that kids are able to are taught specific skills. It's not just getting the information. It's listening. It's giving good examples. It's avoiding put-downs. And it's including other people. It's making sure that they can work well with one another. Because unless you're a computer programmer, and even then they have to work with people sometimes, or maybe a toll booth worker, you have to work with other people and learn to get along with them. There's the research on cooperative learning is a little bit different. And like I said, I'm going to go over a couple other ones too. We have Jigsaw, in which Students are assigned usually to 6-member teams to work on academic material that has been broken down into sections. I watched a teacher do this just recently where they were doing, they were studying all the different continents. And then the first time he did it where he lectured and he did all the lecture stuff and the kids just sat there and he did like South America, I think it was. And, he told them all about the import, export and all that. And the kids were like dying. And they took the test and they got like a 70 on the test and they did fine. That was like the group average was like a 74 or 5. And then the next time he did a jigsaw. Well, what he did was actually assign kids to different countries in Africa because they were looking at Africa. And he studied different countries in Africa. But in each group, he had a textile person, a person who did like their clothing and all that kind of stuff. Then he had a food person, the person that was supposed to know about all their food. Then he did an import-export, like what was a major import and export. Then he did a topography or somebody who knew all about the topography of the country. Then he did one about culture and customs and religion. And I'm trying to think. So he had dress, culture, custom, religion, import, export. Oh, population, just general statistics like population and stuff like that. And what kind of government they had. And then of those 6 people, he had other 6 groups. So like all of the people that were looking at population got together and all the people that were looking at clothing got together. But that person was responsible for that part of the presentation for their particular country. So he broke them up and had them go jigsaw into their each individual topics, and he had all the resources for them. And then he had them go back in their groups, their country groups, and then they had to put all that information together in order to make this cohesive presentation. And so the kids really knew about all the different countries because they had worked in their individual groups and talked about their individual groups. But then they went back to their individual country, and then they had to critique each other's presentations on it. And so it was a project-based learning because they were doing this big project where they had to do a PowerPoint and they actually had to make food. And some of the kids actually made dresses and, actually made the garb and made it like a fashion show of what those different clothing that people would wear in those different countries. And it was interesting in their customs. But the kids, the average score on the test on Africa ended up being like 92% because the kids really got into it and they really understood what they were talking about. The other part of the, let me think, is there anything, I wanted to talk a little bit about Kagan too. Let me go back to this one. Kagan is also another one that I've talked about throughout this one too, and your book talks a little bit about numbered heads together, where students are in 4-member teams are given a secret number from 1 to 4, and then they try and make sure that every team member knows the material, and then the teacher calls on the example of all number 2s have to respond. Think, pair, share. This is another one that they do where you think about it and then you pair up with somebody and then you share. A lot of times Kagan will use this, that they put music on in the classroom and the kids wander around and they give it a question and they have to think about what the answer is. And then when the music stops, whose ever hand is closest to you is the person that you're going to share your answer with. And then they rate each other on how well they knew the answer, and they're filling out their worksheet as they're going along, and making sure that they're comparing answers to one another. And then when they're all done, the teacher will go through and make sure that all the answers are correct. Kagan has probably about 30 or 40 different structures that he does, like numbered heads together, think, pair, share, round robin, rally robin. If you Google Kagan strategies, you'll see a ton of the different ones that go along with it. So the research on it is that kids do well just learning primarily when students work together. They like to work together. Kids are social beings that go along with that, and they're also learning the skills of being able to work together. Studies of cooperative learning methods that incorporate goal setting and individual accountability show substantial positive effects on achievement. So in grades 2 through 12, kids who are in cooperative learning groups and are independently, like if they have to, individually, not independently, but individually held accountable, then there's positive results that go along with it. So another one that they talk about in constructivist approach is problem solving and thinking skills. And students need ability to use information and solve problems. Bottom line, that's what you really want to do. They might be good at adding and subtracting and multiplying, but can they solve the problem in a story problem? This is like the number one thing that businesses complain about. They said that they hate when they get new workers, that they have to tell what to do, that they don't, if they see a problem, they go to their boss and say, what do you want me to do? Where they don't think about how can I solve this problem and just kind of take care of it on their own. And it says, for example, Sylvia bought 4 hamburgers at $1.25 each, 2 orders of fries at 65 cents each, and 3 large sodas at 75 cents each. How much change should she get from that $10 bill? So one of the things when you're looking at problem solving that you have to be able to do is you have to be able to know what relevant information is there. One of the activities that they talk about in your book is to use the ideal, which is identify problems and opportunities, define goals and represent the problem, explore possible strategies, anticipate your outcomes and act. So you got to kind of think through them. You have to hypothetically think through them, which means this is more for middle school and high school kids. I mean, you want to look back and learn from how well did it go? What other feedback did you get? When we teach creative problem solving, one of the things that we always forget is to give a kid incubation time to be able to percolate that answer and think about different ones. But we also have to teach kids to suspend judgment. So if somebody comes up with an answer that you think is really goofy, you don't say, oh my God, that's so stupid. You accept all answers, even if they seem kind of silly. Because one of the things that you want to teach the kid is to think through the problem. And they'll come up with that it was silly on their own. You have to have that conducive climate to be able to do that. So even if a kid, like gives you something like, let's just kill them or whatever the crazy thing is, you have to think through that idea of what would be the consequences of that. What are the results that go along with that? And that goes to that idea of problem analysis, that they actually work through the whole problem as they go through. And that really teaches that application of thinking skills, of the analysis, the synthesis, the judgment that you're doing. And as you're working through all this, you also have to provide feedback for children that go along with it. Your book also talks about means-end analysis, and it's learning to solve problems that require a great deal of practice with different kinds of problems and demand thought. And it involves that idea that that there are a means to an end, that you have to go through this project process in order to get to the final project. And a lot of times students give a set of word problems whose solutions require like the multiplication of 2 numbers, and the students soon learn that they can't solve the problem by just looking at any 2 numbers. So they're kind of doing that trial and error that goes along with means-ends analysis, and it's kind of a logical sequential step, but they may have to do it more than one time to get to the end and the result that they want. The biggest problem that a lot of kids have is extracting that relevant information. That a lot of times, like if you take the SAT test or the ACT test in science, ACT test in science, it's actually a reading test, because what you're really looking for is your ability to think logically and to be able to problem solve logically. And they'll give you too much information. So you have to know which information is relevant and which information is not relevant. And when we teach thinking skills, some of the things that we want to teach is planning, classifying, divergent thinking, identifying assumptions, recognizing misleading information, and then generating questions. When you do problem solving, you usually end up with more questions than you do answers. So thinking skills can be taught through that structured program of creating a culture of thinking in the classroom. And that's a really useful technique of being able to get kids to brainstorm. I have a teacher that has a bulletin board on the back, or like a whiteboard thing, and that's pretty much what they do. They make predictions, and then they come up with scenarios of ways they can solve them. And as they work through the problem throughout the semester, they'll cross out things as they figure out, or they deduce that that's not something that's going to work. So we have inductive and deductive thinking that usually goes into teaching thinking skills. Critical thinking is a key objective in schools to enhance children's ability to think critically and to make rational decisions about what they believe in. Examples of critical thinking is identifying misleading advertisement, fake and real news. Probably the hardest thing for my students was to distinguish between fact and opinion, and also what was real and not real. So I would actually do... I would use the National Enquirer a lot of times, that you had to do and figure out whether or not it was fiction or nonfiction. And I would say, like, do you really think somebody had an alien baby? And so then they would have to do things to support it. So you want to identify misleading advertising. You want to weigh competing evidence and talk about, like, what evidence do we have of that? What makes us think that that's not really true? We want to identify some assumptions and fallacies in the argument and be able to back up what you say by at least 3 facts. As with any objective, learning to think critically requires practice. So we can't just assume somebody's going to know how to do that. It actually has to be practiced. And that pretty much is part of the constructivist approach to thinking. And it involves a lot of problem solving. It involves cooperative learning. It involves doing experiments and top-down lessons.